Jaden Shawn settled into the supple leather seat of first class, feeling the familiar embrace of luxury as he breathed in the subtle blend of vanilla and cedar that permeated the cabin of Elite Atlantic Airways. At 38, he had earned every comfort this seat represented, the sleepless nights building his tech empire, the countless rejections that had only fueled his determination, and the unwavering belief that innovation could bridge the divides that had plagued his community for generations. His company, Horizon Digital Solutions, now stood as a testament to what was possible when brilliance met opportunity, employing over 3,000 people and revolutionizing how corporations approached diversity and inclusion through cutting-edge technology. The soft glow of his laptop screen illuminated his focused expression as he prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most pivotal presentation of his career. Tomorrow's board meeting at Meridian Industries could secure a partnership worth $200 million. A deal that would not only cement his company's future but also fund his ambitious scholarship program for underserved communities. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to craft the opening lines that would capture the essence of his vision, when the sharp click of approaching heels interrupted his concentration. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice that carried the practiced politeness of customer service, though Jaden detected an underlying tension that made him look up from his screen. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Jennifer, stood beside his seat with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm terribly sorry, but there seems to have been a seating error. We need to relocate you to accommodate one of our Diamond Elite members." Jaden felt a familiar tightness in his chest, that same sensation he'd experienced countless times throughout his journey from the housing projects of Detroit to the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. Behind Jennifer stood a woman who radiated entitlement from her perfectly coiffed silver hair to her designer shoes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Evelyn Blackwood, as he would later learn, tapped her manicured nails against a platinum Rolex, her pale blue eyes scanning Jaden with the kind of dismissive assessment he'd grown accustomed to but never accepted. "There must be some confusion," Jaden replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his boarding pass and Elite Atlantic's highest-tier membership card, a black titanium rectangle that represented years of loyal patronage and millions of dollars in business travel. "I specifically reserved seat 1A for this flight. My membership status should have that clearly documented." The cabin had grown noticeably quieter, fellow passengers sensing the tension that crackled in the recycled air. Some pretended to read their magazines while stealing glances at the unfolding drama, others openly stared with the morbid fascination of witnessing a potential spectacle. Jaden was acutely aware of their attention, feeling the weight of representation that had followed him throughout his career, the unspoken pressure to be twice as good, twice as calm, twice as professional in situations where others might simply raise their voice and be heard. Jennifer's smile faltered slightly as she examined his credentials, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly at the sight of his premium membership status. Behind her, Evelyn Blackwood shifted impatiently, whispering something that sounded suspiciously like, "This is ridiculous," to her companion, a younger woman who appeared to be her assistant or perhaps daughter. "Sir, I understand your position," Jennifer continued, though her voice now carried a note of uncertainty, "but Mrs. Blackwood has been flying with us for over 20 years. She has certain expectations about her seating arrangements. Perhaps we could upgrade you to our premium economy section. It's quite comfortable, and we'd be happy to provide complimentary champagne service." The offer hung in the air like a poorly disguised insult. Jaden felt the familiar fire that had driven him through every obstacle in his path, the same determination that had pushed him through MIT on a full scholarship, that had sustained him through the early days of his company when venture capitalists dismissed his ideas before he'd even finished his pitch, that had carried him through the loneliness of being often the only black face in rooms full of decision-makers who looked nothing like him. "I appreciate the offer," Jaden said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, "but I'm not moving. This is my assigned seat, which I reserved and paid for. If Mrs. Blackwood requires specific accommodations, I'm sure your crew can find an alternative solution that doesn't involve displacing paying customers." The words landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through the pretense and laying bare the real issue at hand. Around them, smartphones began to emerge from pockets and purses as passengers sensed they were witnessing something significant. The age of social media had made everyone a potential documentarian, and Jaden was keenly aware that whatever happened next would likely be preserved for posterity. Evelyn Blackwood's face flushed with indignation, her carefully maintained composure cracking like expensive porcelain. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she declared, her voice carrying the imperious tone of someone unaccustomed to being denied anything. "I've been flying first class with this airline since before." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Jaden with undisguised disdain. "I demand to speak with the captain immediately." Jennifer looked between Jaden and Mrs. Blackwood like a tennis spectator following a particularly intense rally. The young flight attendant was clearly out of her depth, caught between company policy, customer service protocols, and what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. Her hand moved instinctively to the communication device clipped to her uniform, and Jaden knew that whatever happened next would escalate far beyond a simple seating dispute. "Ma'am, please let me speak with my supervisor," Jennifer said, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine anxiety. "I'm sure we can resolve this situation to everyone's satisfaction." But Jaden could see in her eyes that she already knew how this would play out. He'd witnessed this script too many times before, the assumption that he was the problem, the expectation that he would quietly acquiesce to avoid making a scene, the belief that his comfort and dignity were somehow less important than maintaining the status quo. What none of them realized was that Jaden Shawn had spent his entire career refusing to accept such assumptions, and he wasn't about to start now. As Jennifer hurried toward the galley to summon reinforcements, Jaden opened his laptop once more, but instead of returning to his presentation, he activated the recording function on his phone. If this situation was going to escalate, he wanted an accurate record of exactly what transpired. He'd learned long ago that in a world where his word might be questioned, documentation was his most powerful ally. The cabin continued to buzz with whispered conversations and the subtle sounds of passengers positioning themselves for better views of the unfolding drama. Jaden remained calm, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed but alert. He thought of his grandmother, who had cleaned offices in downtown Detroit for 40 years, always with dignity intact despite the indignities she faced. He thought of his father, who had worked double shifts at the auto plant to ensure his son could attend the best schools. He thought of the thousands of young people who looked up to him as proof that their dreams were achievable. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. This was about every time someone had been made to feel less than, every time privilege had been wielded as a weapon, every time silence had been mistaken for acceptance. Jaden Shawn had built his fortune on the principle that technology could level playing fields and create opportunities where none had existed before. Today, he would discover whether that same principle applied to 30,000 feet above the ground. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of what Jaden assumed would be the next act in this unfolding drama. He saved his work, closed his laptop with deliberate care, and prepared to face whatever came next with the same grace and determination that had carried him through every challenge in his remarkable journey from the streets of Detroit to the pinnacle of American business success. What he couldn't have anticipated was that this single flight would not only test everything he believed about justice and dignity but would ultimately transform not just his own life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways that none of them could possibly imagine. The real journey was just beginning. The supervisor who approached Jaden's seat carried himself with the kind of rigid authority that suggested years of dealing with difficult passengers and corporate protocols. David Chen, according to his name tag, was a man in his early 50s whose weathered face spoke of countless flights and countless conflicts resolved through a combination of diplomacy and firm adherence to company policy. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something that Jaden couldn't quite identify, perhaps uncertainty, perhaps recognition of the delicate nature of the situation unfolding before him. "Mr. Shawn," David began, having clearly been briefed on the passenger's identity during his approach, "I'm David Chen, the senior cabin supervisor for this flight. I understand there's been some confusion about seating arrangements." Jaden noted the careful choice of words, confusion rather than dispute or problem. It was the language of corporate damage control, designed to minimize the appearance of conflict while maneuvering toward a predetermined resolution. He'd heard similar phrasing in countless business negotiations, and he recognized it for what it was, the opening gambit in what was likely to be a carefully orchestrated attempt to make him the path of least resistance. "There's no confusion on my part," Jaden replied evenly, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had served him well in boardrooms filled with skeptical investors and hostile competitors. "I have a confirmed reservation for this seat. I'm a platinum member of your frequent flyer program, and I've complied with all boarding procedures. The confusion seems to be on your airline's part." Behind David, Jennifer shifted nervously while Evelyn Blackwood maintained her imperious stance, arms crossed in a posture that suggested she viewed this entire interaction as beneath her dignity. The other passengers had largely abandoned any pretense of minding their own business, with several phones now openly recording the exchange. Jaden was acutely aware that whatever happened next would likely be dissected and analyzed across social media platforms within hours. David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and Jaden caught a glimpse of the calculation happening behind his professional facade. The supervisor was clearly weighing multiple factors: company policy, customer satisfaction metrics, potential public relations fallout, and the unspoken but ever-present consideration of which passenger was more likely to cause problems if their demands weren't met. "Sir, I completely understand your position," David continued, his tone taking on the practiced cadence of someone delivering a well-rehearsed speech. "However, Mrs. Blackwood is one of our most valued customers, and she has certain expectations based on her long history with Elite Atlantic Airways. We're prepared to offer you a significant upgrade to our premium economy section, along with a voucher for a future flight and complimentary access to our executive lounge on your next visit." The offer was generous by most standards, but Jaden recognized it for what it truly was: a bribe disguised as customer service, an attempt to purchase his compliance with perks and privileges. It was the same strategy he'd encountered throughout his career, the assumption that every principle had a price, that dignity could be negotiated away with the right combination of incentives. "Mr. Chen," Jaden said, his voice taking on the edge that his employees recognized as a signal that their CEO was about to make a point that would not be open for debate, "I'm not interested in your upgrades or vouchers. I'm interested in receiving the service I paid for, in the seat I reserved, without being asked to accommodate someone else's sense of entitlement." The word "entitlement" landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of tension throughout the immediate area. Evelyn Blackwood's face flushed crimson, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of what she clearly perceived as an unforgivable insult. "How dare you!" she exclaimed, her voice rising to a pitch that carried throughout the cabin. "I have been flying first class longer than you've probably been able to afford it. This is outrageous." The racist undertone in her words was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of coded language that Jaden had learned to recognize and call out throughout his career. Around them, passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some nodding in agreement with Mrs. Blackwood's outrage, others clearly disturbed by the implications of her statement. Jaden felt the familiar surge of anger that had fueled his determination throughout his life, but he channeled it into the kind of controlled response that had made him one of the most respected voices in corporate America. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying across the cabin with crystal clarity, "my ability to afford first class isn't in question here. What's in question is whether this airline treats all of its paying customers with equal respect, regardless of their background or the color of their skin." The words hung in the air like an accusation, impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Several passengers gasped audibly, while others leaned forward in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple seating dispute. The age of viral videos and social justice movements had made everyone acutely aware of the power of such moments to spark broader conversations about equality and fairness. David Chen's face had gone pale, clearly recognizing that the situation had escalated far beyond his ability to manage through standard customer service protocols. His hand moved instinctively toward his communication device, and Jaden knew that the next phase of this confrontation was about to begin. "Sir," David said, his voice now carrying a note of warning, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and cooperate with our crew. If you continue to be disruptive, we'll have no choice but to involve security." The threat was delivered with the kind of bureaucratic authority that was designed to intimidate, but Jaden had faced down hostile takeover attempts and congressional hearings. A flight supervisor's ultimatum was hardly going to shake his resolve. "I'm being disruptive?" Jaden asked, his voice rising just enough to ensure that every passenger in the cabin could hear him clearly. "I'm sitting quietly in my assigned seat, speaking respectfully to your crew, and asking only to receive the service I paid for. If that's disruptive, then perhaps your airline needs to examine its definition of the word." Around them, the sound of phones recording became more obvious as passengers recognized they were witnessing a moment that would likely become part of a much larger conversation. Jaden was aware of the cameras, but he'd learned long ago that authenticity was his greatest asset. He had nothing to hide and everything to gain by ensuring that his side of the story was accurately documented. Jennifer, who had been standing silently throughout the exchange, suddenly stepped forward with an expression of barely concealed panic. "Mr. Chen," she whispered urgently, "perhaps we should speak with the captain." David's jaw tightened, and Jaden could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Involving the captain would escalate the situation to the highest level of authority on the aircraft, but it would also create a paper trail and potentially expose the airline to greater liability if the situation was mishandled. "Very well," David said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had run out of options. "I'll speak with Captain Rodriguez. But sir, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. This doesn't have to become a bigger issue than it already is." As David walked toward the cockpit, Jaden felt a moment of quiet satisfaction. He'd forced the airline to escalate the situation to its highest authority, which meant that whatever happened next would be a matter of official record. More importantly, he'd refused to be intimidated or bought off, maintaining his dignity in the face of pressure that was designed to make him fold. But as he watched David disappear into the cockpit, Jaden also felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. He'd been here before, the only black face in a room full of people who viewed his presence as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a right to be respected. The difference was that this time, the entire confrontation was being documented by dozens of witnesses, each with the power to share their perspective with the world. What Jaden couldn't have known was that in the cockpit, a conversation was taking place that would transform this incident from a simple customer service dispute into something far more complex and dangerous. Captain Elena Rodriguez was listening to David's briefing with growing concern, not just about the immediate situation, but about information she'd received earlier that morning that cast Jaden Shawn in an entirely different light. The flight that had begun as a routine journey to a crucial business meeting was about to become something none of them could have anticipated, a test not just of Jaden's principles, but of the very systems and assumptions that governed how power, privilege, and justice intersected at 30,000 feet above the ground. Captain Elena Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, her uniform crisp and her expression serious as she surveyed the tense scene in the first-class cabin. At 45, she had navigated her way through the male-dominated world of commercial aviation through a combination of exceptional skill, unwavering professionalism, and the kind of diplomatic finesse that had resolved countless passenger disputes over her 20-year career. But as she approached Jaden Shawn's seat, something in her demeanor suggested that this situation was unlike any she had previously encountered. "Mr. Shawn," she began, her voice carrying the authority that came with being responsible for the safety and security of everyone aboard the aircraft, "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I understand there's been a disagreement about seating arrangements, but I'm afraid we have a more serious concern that needs to be addressed." Jaden looked up from his phone, where he had been reviewing the recording he'd made of the previous exchanges, and immediately sensed that the dynamic had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. The captain's tone wasn't that of someone trying to resolve a customer service issue, it was the voice of someone delivering official notification of a problem that transcended the boundaries of normal passenger relations. "Captain," Jaden replied, his voice steady despite the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation, "I'm not sure what concern you're referring to. I've been nothing but cooperative with your crew, despite being asked to give up a seat I legitimately reserved and paid for." Captain Rodriguez glanced briefly at David Chen, who had positioned himself slightly behind her with an expression that Jaden couldn't quite read. There was something in the supervisor's eyes, a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension that suggested he knew something Jaden didn't. "Sir," the captain continued, her voice taking on the formal tone that pilots used when following specific protocols, "We've received information suggesting that you may pose a security risk to this flight. I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me so we can address this matter properly." The words hit Jaden like a physical blow, the implications so shocking and unexpected that for a moment he couldn't formulate a response. Around him, the cabin had gone completely silent, passengers straining to hear every word of an exchange that had suddenly taken on the gravity of a potential security incident. A security risk? Jaden finally managed, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "Captain, I think you need to be very specific about what you're alleging, because I can assure you that whatever information you've received is either mistaken or deliberately false." The captain's expression remained neutral, but Jaden caught a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps doubt, perhaps recognition that the situation was more complex than she had initially been led to believe. Behind her, he could see Evelyn Blackwood watching the exchange with barely concealed satisfaction, her earlier indignation replaced by the smug expression of someone whose problem was being solved in exactly the way she had hoped. "Sir, I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific details of the security concern," Captain Rodriguez replied, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. "What I can tell you is that we have protocols we must follow when such information is brought to our attention. I'm asking you to cooperate with those protocols." Jaden felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried him through every major challenge in his career, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a cold realization that he was being systematically railroaded by people who had decided that removing him from the flight was preferable to addressing the real issue at hand. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when addressing hostile board members or skeptical investors, "I'm going to be very clear about what's happening here. Your crew attempted to remove me from my assigned seat to accommodate another passenger. When I refused to comply with that inappropriate request, the situation was escalated through your chain of command. Now, suddenly, I'm being labeled a security risk. I think any reasonable person would see this as a pattern of escalating pretexts designed to achieve the same end result." The captain's jaw tightened slightly, and Jaden could see that his words had hit their mark. Around them, passengers were openly recording the exchange, their phones capturing every word and gesture for what would undoubtedly become a viral documentation of the incident. Furthermore, Jaden continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in familiar territory, the realm of logical argument and systematic dismantling of weak positions, "I'm going to need you to be very specific about the nature of this alleged security risk. As a frequent flyer and a business owner with government contracts, I maintain security clearances that are regularly updated and verified. Any suggestion that I pose a threat to aviation security is not only false but potentially defamatory." The mention of government contracts and security clearances clearly caught Captain Rodriguez off guard, her expression shifting as she processed information that didn't align with whatever briefing she had received. David Chen, meanwhile, had gone noticeably pale, suggesting that this particular detail hadn't been part of his calculations when he had escalated the situation. "Sir," the captain said, though her voice now carried a note of uncertainty, "I understand your position, but I have to follow the protocols that have been established for situations like this. If you could just come with me, we can sort this out privately and hopefully resolve any misunderstanding." But Jaden had spent too many years in boardrooms and negotiation sessions to miss the subtle shift in the captain's demeanor. Her initial confidence had been replaced by the kind of careful language that suggested she was beginning to realize that the situation was more complicated than she had been led to believe. "Captain," Jaden said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in rooms filled with Fortune 500 executives, "I'm not going anywhere until you provide me with specific information about this alleged security concern. If there's a legitimate threat assessment, there should be documentation. If there's been a complaint filed, I have the right to know the nature of that complaint. What I won't do is allow myself to be removed from this aircraft based on vague allegations that conveniently arose only after I refused to give up my seat." The standoff that followed was electric with tension, the captain clearly weighing her options while Jaden maintained his position with the kind of calm determination that had carried him through every major challenge in his career. Around them, the cabin had become a theater, with passengers serving as an audience to a drama that was rapidly becoming something much larger than a simple customer service dispute. What none of them realized was that this moment, this test of wills between a successful black entrepreneur and the systems designed to maintain order and hierarchy, was being captured and transmitted in real time to a world that was increasingly hungry for authentic documentation of how power and privilege operated in American society. The captain's next words would determine not just Jaden Shawn's immediate fate, but the trajectory of a story that was about to become a defining moment in the ongoing conversation about equality, justice, and the courage required to stand up for one's principles in the face of institutional pressure. As Captain Rodriguez opened her mouth to respond, Jaden activated the recording function on his phone once more, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved with perfect clarity for the judgment of history. The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point as Captain Rodriguez hesitated, clearly struggling with a decision that would have far-reaching consequences regardless of which direction she chose. Jaden could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of protocols against common sense, of company policy against potential liability, of the immediate pressure to resolve the situation against the growing awareness that she might be participating in something fundamentally unjust. "Captain," Jaden said, his voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision, "I'm going to make this very simple for you. Either provide me with specific, documented evidence of this alleged security concern, or acknowledge that this is an attempt to remove me from the aircraft for reasons that have nothing to do with safety or security." The challenge was delivered with the kind of calm authority that Jaden had perfected over years of high-stakes negotiations, but it carried an undertone that everyone in the cabin could recognize. This was a man who would not be intimidated, manipulated, or quietly shuffled aside for the convenience of others. Captain Rodriguez glanced again at David Chen, and in that moment of eye contact, Jaden caught something that made his blood run cold. There was a communication happening between them, a shared understanding that suggested this entire scenario had been orchestrated from the beginning. The security concern wasn't a legitimate threat assessment, it was a pretext, carefully constructed to provide legal cover for what was essentially a discriminatory removal. "Sir," the captain said finally, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of someone following a script, "I'm not required to provide you with specific details of security concerns. What I am required to do is ensure the safety of all passengers on this aircraft. I'm asking you one final time to gather your belongings and come with me." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword, but Jaden had faced down hostile takeover attempts and congressional investigations. He wasn't about to be cowed by bureaucratic intimidation, especially when he could see the fundamental weakness in their position. "Captain Rodriguez," he replied, his voice carrying across the cabin with perfect clarity, "you're asking me to comply with a request based on allegations you refuse to specify, using protocols you won't explain, to address a security concern that conveniently materialized only after I refused to give up my seat to accommodate another passenger's sense of entitlement. I think any reasonable person would recognize this for what it is." Around them, passengers were leaning forward in their seats, phones recording every word of an exchange that was rapidly becoming a masterclass in how institutional power could be wielded to silence dissent. Jaden was acutely aware of his audience, but more importantly, he was aware of the broader implications of this moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been made to feel that their dignity was negotiable, that their rights were conditional, that their voice could be silenced through the application of bureaucratic pressure. This was about the thousands of young entrepreneurs who looked up to him as proof that success was possible despite the obstacles they faced. Furthermore, Jaden continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm, "I want everyone in this cabin to understand what they're witnessing. A paying customer, with a confirmed reservation and premium membership status, is being threatened with removal because he refused to give up his seat to accommodate someone who believes her preferences supersede his rights." When standard customer service pressure failed, the situation was escalated to security concerns that cannot be specified or documented. The words landed like hammer blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of the pretense that had been constructed around the situation. Several passengers nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable as they recognized the implications of what Jaden was describing. Evelyn Blackwood, who had been watching the exchange with growing satisfaction, suddenly stepped forward with an expression of righteous indignation. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she declared, her voice carrying the imperious tone of someone unaccustomed to having her authority questioned. "Captain, I don't understand why we're still discussing this. The man is clearly being disruptive and refusing to follow crew instructions." But her intervention proved to be a tactical error, because it reminded everyone present of the original catalyst for the entire confrontation. Jaden seized the opportunity immediately. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, turning to face her directly, "I think you've said quite enough. Your sense of entitlement to my seat, and your apparent belief that your 20 years of flying first class somehow gives you the right to displace other passengers, is exactly the kind of thinking that this situation is really about." The exchange between Jaden and Mrs. Blackwood was captured by dozens of phones, creating a perfect encapsulation of the broader social dynamics at play. Here was a successful black entrepreneur, calmly and articulately defending his rights, facing off against a wealthy white woman who clearly believed that her status entitled her to special treatment. Captain Rodriguez, meanwhile, was looking increasingly uncomfortable as she realized that the situation had spiraled far beyond her ability to control through standard protocols. The presence of so many recording devices meant that whatever happened next would be scrutinized and analyzed by millions of people, and the airline's handling of the situation would become a case study in corporate crisis management. "Mr. Shawn," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of desperation, "I'm trying to resolve this situation in a way that works for everyone. If you would just—" "Captain," Jaden interrupted, his voice cutting through her attempt at diplomatic resolution, "there is no compromise position here. Either I have the same rights as every other passenger on this aircraft, or I don't. Either your airline treats all customers with equal respect, or it doesn't. Either you're going to enforce your policies fairly and consistently, or you're going to participate in a system that privileges some passengers over others based on factors that have nothing to do with their behavior or their compliance with your rules." The stark choice that Jaden presented left no room for middle ground, no space for the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that might have allowed everyone to save face while perpetuating the underlying injustice. He had forced the situation into the realm of fundamental principles, where the only options were justice or complicity. As the captain struggled to formulate a response that might salvage the situation, Jaden felt his phone vibrate with an incoming message. He glanced down briefly and saw a text from his assistant, "Jaden, social media is exploding. #Flight Justice is trending. The whole world is watching." The realization that this confrontation had already transcended the boundaries of the aircraft sent a surge of both responsibility and determination through Jaden. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel that their rights were conditional, their voice was unwelcome, their presence was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a contribution to be valued. What happened next would determine not just the outcome of this particular incident, but the broader message that would be sent about how power, privilege, and justice intersected in American society. Jaden Shawn had spent his entire career proving that excellence could overcome prejudice, but today he was discovering that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in boardrooms or laboratories, but in the everyday spaces where ordinary people were forced to choose between dignity and convenience. The captain's next words would either validate that choice or reveal the true cost of standing up for one's principles in a world that often preferred silence to justice. As Captain Rodriguez opened her mouth to deliver what Jaden sensed would be her final ultimatum, the unexpected sound of approaching footsteps from the rear of the aircraft drew everyone's attention. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s was making his way forward through the cabin, his purposeful stride and confident demeanor immediately commanding attention from both passengers and crew. "Excuse me, Captain," the man said as he reached the first-class section, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. "I'm Senator James Mitchell, and I believe I need to intervene in this situation before it goes any further." The revelation that a United States Senator had been witnessing the entire confrontation sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. Jaden recognized the name immediately. Senator Mitchell was the ranking member of the Senate Transportation Committee and a vocal advocate for civil rights legislation. His presence on the flight was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence that the situation had already attracted attention from the highest levels of government. Captain Rodriguez's face went pale as she realized that the incident she had been trying to manage quietly had suddenly acquired a witness whose word would carry significant weight in any subsequent investigation or legal proceeding. David Chen, meanwhile, looked as though he might be physically ill as the full implications of the situation began to dawn on him. "Senator Mitchell," the captain said, her voice betraying the strain of trying to maintain professional composure while dealing with a rapidly deteriorating situation, "I appreciate your concern, but this is an internal airline matter that we're handling according to our established protocols." Senator Mitchell's expression hardened as he looked around the cabin, taking in the scene of dozens of passengers recording the confrontation, the obvious tension between Jaden and the crew, and the barely concealed satisfaction on Evelyn Blackwood's face. "Captain," the senator said, his voice carrying the weight of decades in public service, "I've been sitting in seat 3C for the past 30 minutes, and I've witnessed this entire exchange. What I've seen is a paying customer being systematically harassed and threatened with removal for the apparent crime of refusing to give up his legitimately reserved seat. If these are your established protocols, then your airline has some serious explaining to do." The senator's intervention transformed the dynamic of the confrontation completely. Jaden felt a surge of vindication as he realized that his assessment of the situation had been validated by someone whose credibility was beyond question. More importantly, the presence of a Senate Transportation Committee member meant that whatever happened next would likely trigger a formal investigation into the airline's practices. Furthermore, Senator Mitchell continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject, "I've heard allegations of security concerns that cannot be specified, threats of removal based on undefined protocols, and what appears to be a systematic attempt to intimidate a passenger into compliance through escalating levels of bureaucratic pressure. As someone who has spent considerable time investigating discrimination in the transportation industry, I can tell you that what I've witnessed here follows a very familiar pattern." Jaden felt a moment of profound gratitude for the senator's intervention, but he also recognized that this was a crucial moment in his own journey. He could allow Senator Mitchell to take the lead in resolving the situation, or he could continue to stand up for himself and demonstrate that he didn't need rescue, he needed justice. "Senator Mitchell," Jaden said, his voice carrying across the cabin with perfect clarity, "I appreciate your support, but I want to be very clear about something. I'm not asking for special treatment or intervention based on who I am or who might be watching. I'm asking for the same treatment that any passenger should expect, the right to occupy the seat I reserved and paid for, without being subjected to harassment, intimidation, or removal based on pretexts that cannot be substantiated." The senator nodded approvingly, recognizing the strength and dignity in Jaden's position. "Mr. Shawn, you're absolutely right. This isn't about special treatment, it's about equal treatment. And what I've witnessed here suggests that Elite Atlantic Airways has some fundamental problems with how they define and implement that concept." Captain Rodriguez was now visibly struggling with a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. The presence of a senator, the dozens of recording devices, and the growing awareness that this incident would likely become a major news story had transformed what should have been a routine customer service issue into a potential career-ending crisis. "Senator, Mr. Shawn," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperation, "perhaps we could discuss this matter privately and find a resolution that works for everyone involved." But Jaden had spent too many years in high-stakes negotiations to miss the significance of the captain's shift in tone. The offer of private discussion was an admission that the airline's position was indefensible in public, and that they were hoping to find a way to make the problem disappear without addressing the underlying issues. "Captain Rodriguez," Jaden replied, his voice steady and resolute, "I think we're well past the point of private discussions. This situation has been conducted in full view of your passengers from the beginning, and I see no reason to change that now. If your airline has policies that justify the treatment I've received, then you should be comfortable defending those policies in public." Senator Mitchell stepped closer to the captain, his expression serious as he prepared to deliver what Jaden sensed would be a definitive statement about the situation. "Captain," the senator said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades holding powerful institutions accountable, "I want you to understand something very clearly. What I've witnessed here today will be the subject of a formal inquiry by the Senate Transportation Committee. Your airline's handling of this situation will be examined in detail, and the policies and procedures that led to this confrontation will be scrutinized by people who have the power to affect your company's operating licenses and federal funding. The threat was delivered with the kind of calm precision that Jaden recognized from his own business dealings, the voice of someone who had the power to back up their words with concrete action. Around them, passengers were leaning forward in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would likely have far-reaching consequences for the airline industry as a whole. Furthermore, Senator Mitchell continued, "I want everyone on this aircraft to understand that what they've witnessed here is not an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern of discrimination and abuse that has plagued the airline industry for far too long. The fact that it took the intervention of a United States Senator to prevent the removal of a paying customer who had committed no offense other than refusing to surrender his rights should be deeply troubling to anyone who believes in equal treatment under the law." Jaden felt a surge of emotion as he listened to the senator's words, recognizing that this moment represented something larger than his own personal vindication. This was about the broader struggle for dignity and equality that had defined his entire career, and the recognition that sometimes the most important battles were fought in the most unexpected places. As the senator finished speaking, Jaden realized that the confrontation had reached a turning point. The airline's position had been thoroughly discredited, their tactics had been exposed, and their handling of the situation had been condemned by someone whose authority was unquestionable. But more importantly, Jaden had proven to himself and to everyone watching that dignity was not negotiable, that rights were not conditional, and that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was simply the refusal to accept it. The flight that had begun as a routine journey to a business meeting had become something far more significant, a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for equality and justice, captured in real time and transmitted to a world that was hungry for authentic examples of courage in the face of institutional pressure. What happened next would determine not just the immediate resolution of this particular incident, but the broader message that would be sent about the power of individual conscience to challenge systemic injustice and create meaningful change. The aftermath of Senator Mitchell's intervention created a palpable shift in the cabin's atmosphere, as if the very air had been charged with the electricity of a moment that everyone present recognized as historically significant. Captain Rodriguez stood frozen, her earlier confidence completely evaporated as she grappled with the reality that her handling of the situation had been thoroughly discredited by one of the most powerful voices in American transportation policy. Jaden felt a complex mixture of vindication and responsibility as he surveyed the scene around him. The dozens of phones still recording, the passengers leaning forward in their seats with rapt attention, the crew members exchanging nervous glances, all of it served as a reminder that this moment would be dissected and analyzed by millions of people who were hungry for authentic examples of how power and privilege operated in American society. "Captain Rodriguez," Jaden said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, "I think it's time for you to make a decision. You can continue to defend the indefensible, or you can acknowledge that your crew's handling of this situation has been inappropriate from the beginning and take steps to correct it." The captain's eyes darted between Jaden, Senator Mitchell, and the sea of recording devices that surrounded them. Jaden could see the calculation happening behind her expression, the weighing of corporate loyalty against personal integrity, of short-term damage control against long-term consequences. "Mr. Shawn," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of defeat, I believe there may have been some miscommunication about the nature of the security concern. Perhaps we should reconsider the situation." The admission was carefully worded to avoid direct liability, but Jaden recognized it for what it was, an acknowledgement that the entire security pretext had been fabricated. Around them, passengers murmured with a mixture of satisfaction and disgust as they witnessed the collapse of the airline's justification for their actions. But Jaden wasn't interested in half measures or face-saving compromises. He had been pushed to this point by a system that assumed he would quietly accept injustice rather than fight for his rights, and he was determined to see the confrontation through to its logical conclusion. "Captain," he replied, his voice steady but implacable, "there was no miscommunication. There was a deliberate attempt to remove me from this aircraft using false pretenses, after your crew failed to pressure me into giving up my seat through standard customer service manipulation. I want you to acknowledge that reality, not hide behind euphemisms about miscommunication." Senator Mitchell nodded approvingly at Jaden's refusal to accept a sanitized version of events. Mr. Shawn is absolutely right, Captain. What we've witnessed here is a systematic abuse of authority, and it deserves to be called by its proper name. The senator's support gave Jaden the confidence to press his advantage further. He had spent his entire career proving that excellence could overcome prejudice, but today he was learning that sometimes the most important victories came not from outperforming expectations, but from refusing to accept treatment that fell below the basic standards of human dignity. Furthermore, Jaden continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm, I want everyone on this aircraft to understand what they've witnessed here today. This isn't just about airline customer service, this is about how institutional power is used to silence dissent and maintain hierarchies that privilege some people over others based on factors that have nothing to do with their behavior or their rights. The words resonated throughout the cabin, capturing the attention of passengers who were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple customer service dispute. Jaden could see recognition dawning in their faces as they processed the broader implications of what had unfolded before them. David Chen, who had been standing silently throughout the senator's intervention, suddenly stepped forward with an expression of barely controlled panic. Mr. Shawn, he said, his voice carrying a note of desperation, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the entire situation. Perhaps we could discuss this privately and find a resolution that works for everyone. But Jaden had heard that same offer of private discussion too many times to be swayed by it now. He recognized it for what it was, an attempt to move the conversation away from public scrutiny, where the airline's position could be defended through bureaucratic maneuvering rather than transparent accountability. Mr. Chen, Jaden replied, his voice carrying the edge that his employees recognized as a signal that their CEO was about to deliver a point that would not be open for negotiation. The time for private discussions was before your crew decided to escalate this situation through multiple levels of intimidation and false accusations. Now that we're here, in full view of dozens of witnesses, I see no reason to retreat into the shadows where your airline can control the narrative. The rejection of Chen's offer sent another ripple of tension through the cabin, as passengers recognized that Jaden was determined to see the confrontation through to its conclusion regardless of the personal cost. His refusal to accept easy compromises or face-saving measures demonstrated a level of principle that many of them had never witnessed in such a high-stakes situation. Senator Mitchell, meanwhile, was observing the exchange with the keen attention of someone who had spent decades studying how power operated in American institutions. Mr. Shawn, he said, his voice carrying a note of admiration, your handling of this situation has been exemplary. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and dignity that we need more of in our society. The senator's praise was gratifying, but Jaden was focused on something larger than personal vindication. He was thinking about the thousands of young entrepreneurs who looked up to him as proof that success was possible despite the obstacles they faced, and the message that this moment would send about the importance of standing up for one's principles even when the cost seemed prohibitive. Senator Mitchell, Jaden replied, his voice carrying across the cabin with perfect clarity, I appreciate your support, but I want to be clear about something. This isn't about courage, it's about basic human dignity. Every person on this aircraft, regardless of their background or their bank account, deserves to be treated with the same level of respect. The fact that standing up for that principle is considered courageous says more about our society than it does about me. The words landed with the force of a moral challenge, forcing everyone present to confront their own assumptions about what constituted normal behavior in situations where power and privilege intersected with questions of justice and equality. As Jaden spoke, his phone vibrated with another message from his assistant, Jaden, this is everywhere. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they're all covering it live. The hashtag flight justice has over 1 million mentions. The whole world is watching. The realization that this confrontation had transcended the boundaries of the aircraft and become a global conversation about justice and equality sent a surge of both responsibility and determination through Jaden. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel that their rights were conditional, their voice was unwelcome, their presence was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a contribution to be valued. What happened next would determine not just the immediate resolution of this particular incident, but the broader message that would be sent about the power of individual conscience to challenge systemic injustice and create meaningful change in a world that often preferred silence to confrontation. The flight that had begun as a routine journey to a crucial business meeting had become something far more significant, a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for equality and justice, captured in real time and transmitted to a world that was ready to witness what happened when principle met power at 30,000 feet above the ground. As the confrontation reached its crescendo, Jaden felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The dozens of phones recording every word, the senator's unwavering support, the captain's obvious discomfort, and the growing awareness among passengers that they were witnessing something extraordinary, all of it combined to create a moment that transcended the boundaries of a simple customer service dispute and entered the realm of social justice theater. But just as Jaden prepared to deliver what he sensed would be his final statement on the matter, an unexpected development changed the entire dynamic of the situation. From the rear of the aircraft came the sound of rapid footsteps, and moments later, a young woman in her 20s appeared in the first-class section, her face flushed with excitement and her phone held high as she live-streamed the scene to what Jaden could only assume was a massive online audience. "This is incredible," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the breathless enthusiasm of someone who had stumbled upon the story of a lifetime. "I'm Sarah Chen, and I'm broadcasting live from Elite Atlantic Flight 447, where we're witnessing what might be the most important civil rights moment of the decade." The revelation that the confrontation was being broadcast live to potentially millions of viewers sent a shock wave through the cabin. Jaden felt a moment of vertigo as he realized that his words and actions were being transmitted in real time to a global audience that was hungry for authentic examples of how justice and injustice played out in everyday American life. Captain Rodriguez looked as though she might faint as the full implications of the situation became clear. Not only was she dealing with a United States senator and dozens of recording passengers, but now the entire confrontation was being broadcast live to an audience that could potentially number in the millions. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice rising with excitement as she panned her camera across the scene, the hashtag #FlightJustice is now trending worldwide, with over 2 million mentions in the past hour. This story is resonating with people across the globe who are tired of seeing discrimination disguised as customer service. Jaden felt a surge of both pride and responsibility as he absorbed the magnitude of what was happening. His refusal to quietly accept injustice had sparked a global conversation about equality and dignity, but it had also placed him at the center of a media storm that would likely follow him for the rest of his career. Senator Mitchell, meanwhile, was observing the unfolding scene with the keen attention of someone who understood the power of public opinion to drive political change. "Mr. Shawn," he said, his voice carrying a note of admiration, "I think you've accomplished something remarkable here today. You've forced a conversation that needed to happen, and you've done it with a level of grace and dignity that should serve as an example to all of us." But Jaden was thinking beyond the immediate moment, considering the long-term implications of what had transpired. He had built his career on the principle that excellence could overcome prejudice, but today he had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in boardrooms or laboratories, but in the everyday spaces where ordinary people were forced to choose between dignity and convenience. "Senator," Jaden replied, his voice carrying across the cabin with the authority that had commanded respect in rooms filled with Fortune 500 executives, "what's remarkable isn't what I've done, it's what it took to get to this point." The fact that it required the intervention of a United States senator, live television coverage, and millions of social media mentions to prevent the removal of a paying customer who had committed no offense other than refusing to surrender his rights should be deeply troubling to anyone who believes in equal treatment under the law. The words landed with the force of a moral indictment, forcing everyone present to confront the uncomfortable reality that Jaden's treatment had been enabled by a system that assumed certain people would quietly accept injustice rather than fight for their rights. Sarah Chen, still broadcasting live, turned her camera toward Jaden as she prepared to ask the question that millions of viewers were undoubtedly wondering about. "Mr. Shawn," she said, her voice carrying the intensity of someone who recognized the historical significance of the moment, "what message do you want to send to people who are watching this around the world?" Jaden paused for a moment, considering the weight of the question and the global audience that was waiting for his response. He thought about his grandmother, who had cleaned offices in downtown Detroit for 40 years while maintaining her dignity despite countless indignities. He thought about his father, who had worked double shifts to ensure his son could attend the best schools. He thought about the thousands of young people who looked up to him as proof that their dreams were achievable. "The message I want to send," Jaden said finally, his voice steady and clear as it carried across the cabin and into the phones that would transmit his words around the world, "is that dignity is not negotiable. Rights are not conditional. And sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is simply the refusal to accept it." The words resonated through the cabin and across the digital networks that were carrying his message to millions of viewers. Jaden could see the impact in the faces of the passengers around him, in the way Senator Mitchell nodded approvingly, and in the obvious discomfort of the airline crew who had been forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Furthermore, Jaden continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm, "I want people to understand that this isn't just about me, and it isn't just about airline customer service. This is about how we treat each other as human beings, and whether we're willing to stand up for our principles even when it's difficult or uncomfortable." Captain Rodriguez, who had been standing silently throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward with an expression of resignation and what Jaden hoped was genuine remorse. "Mr. Shawn," she said, her voice carrying a note of defeat, "I want to apologize for how this situation has been handled. You're absolutely right, you should never have been subjected to this treatment, and I take full responsibility for my crew's actions." The apology was more than Jaden had expected, but he recognized that it was also insufficient to address the broader issues that the confrontation had exposed. "Captain Rodriguez," he replied, his voice steady but implacable, "I appreciate your apology, but what I'm more interested in is what your airline is going to do to ensure that this kind of treatment doesn't happen to other passengers in the future." The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the captain to confront the reality that this incident would likely trigger a comprehensive review of the airline's policies and procedures. Around them, passengers leaned forward in their seats, recognizing that Jaden's question went to the heart of whether this confrontation would result in meaningful change or simply fade into the background noise of social media outrage. As Captain Rodriguez struggled to formulate a response that might salvage some measure of credibility for her airline, Jaden felt his phone vibrate with yet another message from his assistant. "Jaden, the CEO of Elite Atlantic is calling an emergency press conference. The stock price has dropped 15% in the past hour. This is bigger than anyone imagined." The realization that his refusal to quietly accept injustice had triggered a corporate crisis that was being measured in hundreds of millions of dollars sent a surge of both satisfaction and responsibility through Jaden. He had proven that individual conscience could challenge institutional power, but he had also learned that such challenges came with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants. What happened next would determine not just the resolution of this particular incident, but the broader legacy of a moment that had already transcended the boundaries of a single flight and become a defining example of how justice and dignity could triumph over prejudice and institutional inertia. The flight that had begun as a routine journey to a business meeting had become something far more significant, a catalyst for change that would resonate through the airline industry and beyond, proving that sometimes the most important battles for equality and justice were fought not in courtrooms or legislative chambers, but in the everyday spaces where ordinary people chose to stand up for their principles regardless of the cost. 3 hours after the confrontation that had captivated the world, Jaden Shawn found himself in an unprecedented situation. Elite Atlantic Airways Flight 447 had been diverted to Chicago O'Hare International Airport, where a media circus awaited that dwarfed anything he had experienced during his most successful product launches or congressional testimonies. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Jaden could see through the small window a sea of reporters, camera crews, and protesters who had somehow managed to organize a demonstration in the brief time since the incident had gone viral. Senator Mitchell, who had remained by Jaden's side throughout the remainder of the flight, leaned over with an expression of both admiration and concern. "Mr. Shawn," he said quietly, "I hope you're prepared for what's waiting out there. This story has taken on a life of its own, and you're about to become the face of a movement whether you intended to or not." Jaden nodded thoughtfully, his mind racing through the implications of what the senator was telling him. He had built his career on careful planning and strategic thinking, but the events of the past few hours had thrust him into a situation that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. The young man who had grown up in the housing projects of Detroit, who had fought his way through MIT and the venture capital world, was about to step off an airplane and into the center of a national conversation about justice, dignity, and the power of individual conscience to challenge institutional authority. "Senator," Jaden replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what awaited him, "I didn't choose this moment, but I'm not going to run from it either. If my experience can help other people understand that they don't have to accept injustice quietly, then whatever comes next will be worth it." As the aircraft came to a stop at the gate, Captain Rodriguez approached Jaden one final time, her expression a mixture of professional obligation and personal remorse. "Mr. Shawn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that what happened today will never happen again on any flight I command. You've taught me something important about leadership and accountability, and I won't forget it." Jaden studied the captain's face, searching for signs of sincerity beneath the obvious professional damage control. What he saw there surprised him, genuine remorse, and what appeared to be a real commitment to change. "Captain Rodriguez," he replied, extending his hand in a gesture of reconciliation, "I believe you mean that. The question is whether your airline's leadership will support the kind of changes that need to happen, or whether they'll treat this as a public relations problem to be managed rather than a systemic issue to be addressed." The handshake between Jaden and Captain Rodriguez was captured by Sarah Chen's still-rolling live stream, creating an image that would be replayed countless times in the coming days as a symbol of how conflict could be transformed into understanding through honest dialogue and mutual respect. As the aircraft door opened and passengers began to disembark, Jaden felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders once again. The dozens of fellow passengers who approached him with words of support and gratitude, the flight attendants who offered quiet apologies for their role in the confrontation, and the growing roar of the crowd outside the terminal, all of it served as a reminder that his refusal to quietly accept injustice had resonated far beyond the boundaries of a single flight. But it was the message from his assistant that truly drove home the magnitude of what had transpired. "Jaden," the president's office called. "They want to invite you to the White House to discuss your experience and its implications for civil rights policy. Also, Harvard Business School wants you to deliver the keynote address at their leadership conference next month. And there are 17 interview requests from major networks. This is unprecedented." As Jaden made his way through the jet bridge toward the terminal, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scared kid from Detroit who had been told he didn't belong in elite academic institutions, the young entrepreneur who had been dismissed by venture capitalists who couldn't see past their own prejudices, the CEO who had built a billion-dollar company while fighting against the assumption that success and social consciousness were mutually exclusive. All of those experiences had prepared him for this moment when individual conscience met institutional power and refused to blink. The terminal erupted in chaos as Jaden emerged into the gate area. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and security personnel struggled to maintain order as hundreds of people pressed forward to catch a glimpse of the man who had become an overnight symbol of resistance to injustice. But through the noise and confusion, Jaden could hear something else. The voices of ordinary people expressing gratitude for his courage, sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment, and drawing inspiration from his example. "Mr. Shawn. Mr. Shawn." The questions came from all directions, a cacophony of voices seeking sound bites and explanations for a story that had captured the world's attention. But Jaden had learned long ago that the most powerful communication happened not through prepared statements or media interviews, but through authentic human connection. He stopped in the middle of the terminal, raised his hand for quiet, and waited as the crowd gradually settled into expectant silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms and congressional hearing rooms, but now it was amplified by the moral authority that came from having stood up for his principles when it mattered most. 3 hours ago, Jaden began, his voice carrying clearly through the terminal, "I was just a businessman trying to get to an important meeting. I had no intention of becoming the center of a national conversation about justice and dignity. But sometimes life puts us in situations where we have to choose between our comfort and our principles, between going along to get along and standing up for what's right." The crowd listened in rapt attention as Jaden continued, his words being broadcast live across multiple networks and social media platforms to an audience that numbered in the tens of millions. "What happened on that airplane wasn't really about airline customer service," he said, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "It was about something much more fundamental, the question of whether we're willing to accept a society where some people's dignity is negotiable, where some people's rights are conditional, where some people are expected to quietly accept injustice for the convenience of others." The words resonated through the terminal and across the digital networks that were carrying his message around the world. Jaden could see the impact in the faces of the people around him, in the way reporters leaned forward to catch every word, and in the growing sense that this moment was about something larger than a single incident on a single flight. "I want to be very clear about something," Jaden continued, his voice taking on the edge that his employees recognized as a signal that their CEO was about to make a point that would not be open for debate. "I didn't do anything heroic today. I simply refused to accept treatment that fell below the basic standards of human dignity. The fact that such a refusal is considered newsworthy says more about our society than it does about me." As Jaden finished speaking and began to make his way through the crowd toward the exit, he felt a profound sense of both accomplishment and responsibility. He had proven that individual conscience could challenge institutional power, but he had also learned that such challenges came with obligations that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The flight that had begun as a routine journey to a business meeting had become something far more significant, a catalyst for change that would resonate through the airline industry and beyond, proving that sometimes the most important battles for equality and justice were fought not in courtrooms or legislative chambers, but in the everyday spaces where ordinary people chose to stand up for their principles regardless of the cost. As Jaden stepped out of the terminal and into the Chicago afternoon, he knew that his life had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past few hours. But more importantly, he knew that his refusal to quietly accept injustice had sparked a conversation that was long overdue, and that the real work of creating meaningful change was just beginning. The young man from Detroit who had built a technology empire on the principle that innovation could bridge divides and create opportunities had discovered that sometimes the most powerful technology was the simple refusal to accept that things had to remain the way they had always been. And in that discovery, he had found not just personal vindication, but a new purpose that would define the next chapter of his remarkable journey from the housing projects to the heights of American business success. The flight was over, but the movement it had sparked was just taking off. Epilogue, 6 months later. Jaden Shawn stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Detroit headquarters, gazing out at the city skyline that had shaped his earliest dreams and ambitions. The view from the 42nd floor of the Renaissance Center offered a panoramic perspective of the Motor City's ongoing transformation, a fitting metaphor for the changes that had swept through his own life and the broader airline industry in the months following what the media had dubbed the flight heard round the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across his office, illuminating the wall of awards and recognition that had accumulated since that fateful day on Elite Atlantic Flight 447. The Presidential Medal of Freedom sat alongside the NAACP's highest honor, while framed magazine covers from Time, Newsweek, and Forbes created a visual timeline of how his story had resonated across American society. But it was the handwritten letters from ordinary people, students, workers, parents, and dreamers who had found inspiration in his example, that Jaden treasured most. His assistant, Patricia, knocked softly on the door before entering with the morning briefing that had become a ritual in the months since his life had been transformed by a single act of principled resistance. "Good morning, Jaden," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had witnessed her boss navigate the transition from successful entrepreneur to reluctant civil rights icon with grace and determination. "The final numbers are in from the Elite Atlantic settlement." Jaden turned from the window, his expression thoughtful as he prepared to hear the conclusion of a legal and financial saga that had captivated the business world. The lawsuit he had filed against Elite Atlantic Airways had become a landmark case in civil rights law, establishing new precedents for how discrimination in the transportation industry would be addressed and compensated. "The total settlement is $47 million, Patricia continued, her voice betraying a hint of amazement at the figure despite having worked with the legal team throughout the negotiations. "But more importantly, the consent decree requires Elite Atlantic to implement the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training program in aviation history, with independent monitoring for the next 5 years. Jaden nodded slowly, processing the magnitude of what had been achieved. The financial settlement, while substantial, had never been his primary motivation. What mattered more was the systemic change that would prevent other passengers from experiencing the humiliation and injustice he had faced. The consent decree would serve as a model for the entire industry, establishing new standards for how airlines treated their customers regardless of race, background, or perceived status. "There's more," Patricia added, consulting her tablet with the efficiency that had made her indispensable during the chaotic months following the incident. The Department of Transportation announced this morning that they're implementing the Shawn standards, new federal regulations for airline customer service that were directly inspired by your case. Every major carrier will be required to adopt similar policies within 18 months. The news sent a surge of satisfaction through Jaden, validation that his refusal to quietly accept injustice had created ripple effects that extended far beyond his personal experience. The Shawn standards would protect millions of future passengers from the kind of discriminatory treatment that had once been considered an unfortunate but acceptable part of air travel. But it was the next item in Patricia's briefing that truly captured the scope of how that single flight had transformed not just Jaden's life, but the lives of countless others. The Rise Above Foundation has now provided scholarships to over 2,500 students from underserved communities, she reported, her voice carrying the pride of someone who had helped build something meaningful from the ground up. The Technology Incubator program has launched 43 startups, with a combined valuation of over $200 million. And the anti-bias training program has been implemented by Fortune 500 companies employing more than 1.2 million people. Jaden felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he absorbed the numbers that represented real lives changed, real opportunities created, and real progress toward the more equitable society he had always envisioned. The Rise Above Foundation had become his primary focus in the months following the settlement, channeling the resources and attention generated by his experience into programs that addressed the root causes of inequality and discrimination. The foundation's work had taken him to communities across the country, from inner-city schools in Chicago to rural towns in Mississippi, where he had met young people whose dreams reminded him of his own journey from the housing projects of Detroit to the pinnacles of American business success. Each scholarship recipient, each successful startup, each company that had transformed its culture through the foundation's training programs represented a victory in the ongoing struggle for equality and opportunity. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, her voice taking on a note of excitement that suggested she had saved the best news for last. "The White House called this morning. The President wants to present you with the Presidential Citizens Medal at a ceremony next month, recognizing your contribution to civil rights and social justice. The honor was unprecedented for someone whose activism had emerged from a single act of personal resistance rather than a lifetime of organized advocacy." But Jaden understood that his story had resonated precisely because it demonstrated how ordinary moments could become extraordinary when individuals chose principle over convenience, dignity over compliance. As Patricia left to prepare for the day's meetings, Jaden returned to his position by the window, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The scared kid from Detroit who had been told he didn't belong in elite institutions, the young entrepreneur who had been dismissed by investors who couldn't see past their prejudices, the CEO who had built a billion-dollar company while fighting against systemic barriers, all of those experiences had prepared him for the moment when he had been forced to choose between his comfort and his principles. The choice he had made on Elite Atlantic Flight 447 had cost him nothing and gained him everything. The business meeting he had been traveling to attend had been rescheduled and ultimately proved successful, leading to the partnership that had expanded Horizon Digital Solutions into new markets and created thousands of additional jobs. The media attention had elevated his company's profile and attracted new clients who wanted to work with an organization that embodied the values of equality and justice. But more importantly, his experience had demonstrated that individual conscience could challenge institutional power and create meaningful change. The flight attendants who had participated in his humiliation had undergone extensive retraining and had become advocates for passenger rights within their union. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to a training position where she now taught other pilots about ethical leadership and the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Even Evelyn Blackwood, the woman whose sense of entitlement had triggered the entire confrontation, had reached out through intermediaries to express her remorse and had quietly donated a substantial sum to the Rise Above Foundation as a gesture of atonement for her role in the incident. The transformation of Elite Atlantic Airways had been perhaps the most dramatic outcome of the entire saga. The airline had not only implemented comprehensive policy changes but had embraced them as a competitive advantage, marketing itself as the carrier that treated all passengers with equal respect and dignity. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs, and the company's stock price had recovered and exceeded its pre-incident levels as investors recognized the value of authentic corporate social responsibility. As Jaden prepared for another day of meetings, interviews, and foundation work, he reflected on the lesson that had emerged from his experience, that justice was not something that happened to people, but something that people made happen through their choices and actions. The flight that had begun as a routine journey to a business meeting had become a catalyst for change that continued to resonate through American society, proving that sometimes the most important battles for equality and dignity were fought not in courtrooms or legislative chambers, but in the everyday spaces where ordinary people chose to stand up for their principles. The young man from Detroit who had built a technology empire on the belief that innovation could bridge divides and create opportunities had discovered.